The bitter January wind cut through Grace Zimmer's worn coat as she plunged the shovel into the frozen ground once more, her tears crystallizing on her cheeks before they could fall. The small, lifeless calf lay wrapped in burlap beside the shallow hole, the third one she'd lost this month, and possibly the one that would finally break her. Her ranch was failing, her husband was gone, and now, as the snowflakes began to dance around her in the fading afternoon light, she felt more alone than ever on the Colorado plains. Ethan Wade spotted the solitary figure from a distance as he guided his horse through the gathering storm. New to Colorado City and looking for work after years of drifting, he hadn't expected to find anyone foolish enough to be out in this weather. Drawing closer, he realized it was a woman, struggling against the frozen earth with determination that spoke of desperation. The sight of her small frame hunched over in grief stirred something in him he thought long buried, a need to protect, to help, to not pass by another soul in pain. "Madam," he called out, dismounting his horse and approaching carefully. "You shouldn't be out here alone in this weather." Grace startled, her hand instinctively moving to the small pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt. She hadn't heard anyone approach over the howling wind. A tall stranger stood before her, his face partially obscured by a worn cowboy hat, but his eyes were kind in a way that made her hesitate. "I've managed just fine on my own," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "This needs doing, and there's no one else to do it." Ethan glanced at the small, wrapped bundle and understood immediately. He'd seen enough death on ranches to recognize the situation. Without asking permission, he removed his gloves and took the shovel from her trembling hands. "No more burials alone," he said simply, meeting her eyes. "Not while I'm here." Grace wanted to protest but found she hadn't the strength. She watched as the stranger's powerful arms made short work of what had taken her nearly an hour. When the hole was deep enough, he gently lifted the calf and placed it in the ground with a respect that made her throat tighten. "Thank you," she whispered as he filled in the grave. "Ethan Wade," he offered, tipping his hat slightly. "Just rode into town looking for work. Grace Zimmer. Was my ranch, what's left of it." The snow was falling heavier now, the wind picking up force. Ethan looked toward the small farmhouse in the distance, smoke rising thinly from the chimney. "You'd best get inside, Mrs. Zimmer. Storm's getting worse." "Miss," she corrected, surprising herself. "My husband died 2 years ago, pneumonia." Ethan nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Both losses," he added, glancing at the fresh mound of earth. Grace felt the cold seeping deeper into her bones. "Do you have somewhere to stay in town, Mr. Wade?" "Not yet. Plan to find a room at the boarding house." "Town's 5 miles and this storm's not waiting. There's a stable with a small room attached. It's not much, but it's warm. You're welcome to it for the night." She paused, then added, "In return for your help." Ethan considered her offer, noting the stubborn pride in her stance despite the circumstances. "Much obliged," he replied with a nod. "I'd be grateful." They walked in silence toward the house, the wind pushing against their backs. Grace led the way to the stables, showing him where to shelter his horse alongside her 2 remaining ones. "What happened to your calf?" Ethan asked, removing his saddle from his horse. "Winter's been harsh. Feed's running low, and the mother didn't have enough milk." Grace's voice was matter-of-fact, but Ethan detected the underlying worry. "That's the 3rd one this month. How many cattle do you have left?" 12. "Started with 30 before my husband passed." She looked away, embarrassed by the admission of failure. "Haven't been able to hire help." Most men don't take kindly to working for a woman. Ethan considered this as he settled his horse. "I need work, Miss Zimmer, and I don't much care who signs my pay, long as it's honest." Grace studied him in the dim light of the stable lantern. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard labor. His face was weathered but not unkind, with laugh lines around eyes that had seen much. There was something steady about him that she hadn't seen in a man since her father. "I can't pay much," she admitted. "Barely enough to keep food on my own table. Room and board, and whatever you can spare when cattle sell in spring," Ethan suggested. "I've worked for less." Grace hesitated. Taking on a stranger was risky, but facing the remainder of winter alone seemed riskier still. "We'll try it for a week," she decided. "See how it goes." Ethan nodded, satisfied. "Fair enough. There's stew on the stove. Once you're settled, come to the house and eat something hot before turning in." Ethan watched her trudge through the deepening snow toward the farmhouse. Her shoulders were squared despite her obvious exhaustion, and he found himself admiring her resilience. Colorado City hadn't been his intended destination, but perhaps fate had other plans. The stable room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a small stove, and hooks for clothing. Better than many places he'd laid his head over the years. Ethan quickly attended to his horse before heading toward the main house, the blizzard now in full force around him. The kitchen was warm and smelled of beef stew. Grace had changed into a simple calico dress, her damp coat hanging by the fire. She looked younger indoors, her auburn hair falling in waves around a face that might have been pretty if not drawn with worry and fatigue. "Sit," she instructed, ladling stew into a bowl. "There's coffee, too." Ethan removed his hat and coat, hanging them beside hers, and sat at the wooden table. The stew was simple but hearty, and he ate gratefully, aware of her watching him from across the table. "Where were you headed before the storm caught you?" Grace asked, breaking the silence. "Nowhere in particular. Been drifting since the war ended." "You fought," he nodded, offering no details, and she didn't press. "Many men came west after the war, carrying ghosts they preferred not to name." "I grew up on this ranch," Grace offered instead. "My father left it to me when he died. Met my husband when he came through working cattle drives. We had 5 good years before the fever took him." Ethan appreciated her straightforward manner. No self-pity, just facts. "No children?" he asked, immediately regretting the personal question. "No," she answered simply, her eyes dropping to her hands. "It wasn't meant to be." They fell into silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. When Ethan finished eating, he stood and carried his bowl to the washing basin. "Storm's likely to last through tomorrow," Grace said, rising as well. "If you're willing, there's plenty to be done once it passes. Mending fences, checking the herd, reinforcing the barn roof before it collapses entirely." "I'll be ready at first light, weather permitting," Ethan promised. "Thank you for the meal." Grace nodded, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd shared her table with anyone. "Good night, Mr. Wade." "Ethan," he corrected with a slight smile. "If we're to work together." "Good night, Ethan," she amended, watching as he bundled up against the storm once more. After he left, Grace sat alone by the fire, wondering if she had been foolish to trust a stranger. But there was something about Ethan Wade that felt reliable, solid in a way that had become rare in her experience. And in truth, she was tired of fighting alone. The storm raged through the night and into the next day, just as Grace had predicted. Ethan spent the time making repairs to the stable from the inside, finding tools and lumber that had clearly been untouched since Grace's husband died. He replaced broken boards, fixed leaking spots in the roof, and organized the scattered supplies into some semblance of order. Grace appeared midday, struggling through the snow with a pot of stew and fresh bread. She paused in the doorway, surprised by the transformation. "You've been busy," she observed, setting the food on a workbench. Figured I might as well make myself useful. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag. Found some problems that needed fixing. My husband was always meaning to reorganize in here. Grace glanced around, a flash of pain crossing her features. Never got around to it. James, Ethan said, remembering the name she'd mentioned during their brief conversation at supper. Was he a rancher before you married? No, she smiled slightly. He was a school teacher back east. Came west for adventure, stayed for love. Learned ranching from my father and me. The smile faded. He loved the land, but it didn't come naturally to him like it did to my father. Ethan nodded, understanding. Not everyone's cut out for this life. Takes a certain kind of stubborn. Like me. Grace asked, arching an eyebrow. Exactly like you, he confirmed, a hint of admiration in his voice. Most would have sold after being widowed. Many suggested I should, even had offers. Grace's chin lifted slightly. This land has been in my family for 3 generations. I won't be the one to lose it. Ethan respected her determination, even as he wondered how close to losing everything she truly was. The ranch showed signs of neglect that went beyond what one person could reasonably maintain. They ate together in the stable, discussing what needed to be done once the storm passed. Grace had a clear understanding of ranching, and Ethan found himself impressed by her knowledge. "Where did you learn to ranch?" she asked as they finished eating. "Grew up on one in Texas. Smaller than this. Left to fight when the war broke out, and when I returned, there wasn't much left." Ethan's voice was even, but Grace detected the old pain beneath his words. "Been working other people's land since then." "I'm sorry," she offered simply. Ethan shrugged. "Life happens. We adjust." The storm finally broke on the 3rd day, leaving behind pristine white drifts and a crystalline blue sky. Ethan rose before dawn and made his way to the main house, finding Grace already dressed and preparing a quick breakfast. "We should check the cattle first," she said without preamble. "They're in the south pasture, sheltered by the ridge." Ethan nodded. "I'll saddle the horses." They rode out as the sun crested the horizon, the snow glittering like diamonds in the early morning light. Despite the beauty, Ethan could see Grace's worry in the tight line of her shoulders. The cattle had huddled together during the storm, seeking warmth and protection. As Ethan and Grace approached, he did a quick count. 11. "There's one missing," Grace said, her voice tense as she scanned the herd. They found the stray cow half a mile away, trapped in a snowdrift up to her belly. The animal was weak but alive, her eyes rolling with fear as they approached. "She'll die if we don't get her out," Grace said, dismounting quickly. "The cold will take her." Together they worked to free the frightened animal, digging through the packed snow with their gloved hands. It took nearly an hour of exhausting labor before the cow could pull herself free. "She needs shelter and feed," Grace determined, examining the cow's condition. "She won't last another night out here." "I'll lead her back," Ethan offered. "You go ahead and prepare the barn." By nightfall they were both exhausted but satisfied. The rescued cow was settled in the barn with extra feed. The rest of the herd was accounted for, and they'd managed to check half the fence line for damage. "That was good work today," Grace acknowledged as they sat at her kitchen table, eating a simple supper of beans and cornbread. "I couldn't have saved that cow alone." "No more working alone," Ethan reminded her, echoing his words from their first meeting. "That's why I'm here." Grace studied him across the table, her guard lowering slightly. "Why did you really stop that day, Ethan? Most men would have ridden on." Ethan considered the question, wanting to give her an honest answer. "I know what it's like to bury things alone," he finally said. "Did too much of it during the war. After a while it changes a person, carrying all that by yourself." Grace nodded, understanding more than he realized. "Yes," she agreed quietly. It does. The following weeks established a rhythm between them. They rose early, worked through the daylight hours, and spent evenings planning the next day's tasks. Ethan slept in the stable room, taking his meals with Grace in the main house. The arrangement was practical and respectful, with clear boundaries that neither crossed, yet something was shifting between them. Grace found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, to hearing Ethan's deep voice recount stories from his travels. He was well read for a cowboy, often surprising her with his knowledge of literature and history. She learned he'd had 2 years of college before the war interrupted his education, and that he'd once dreamed of becoming a doctor. For his part, Ethan discovered Grace's fierce intelligence and dry humor. She could recite long passages of Shakespeare from memory, having been taught by her schoolteacher husband. She knew every inch of her land and could predict weather changes with uncanny accuracy. And sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, he caught glimpses of a young woman who might have been carefree once, before responsibility and loss had hardened her edges. By mid-February, the ranch was showing signs of recovery under their combined efforts. Fences were mended, the barn roof repaired, and the cattle were holding their own against the winter's harshness. No more calves had been lost, and the rescued cow was regaining strength daily. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Grace brought out a bottle of whiskey from a cabinet rarely opened. "My father's," she explained, pouring small measures into 2 glasses. "Seems appropriate to mark a month of your employment." Ethan accepted the glass, surprised by the gesture. "Has it been a month already, as of tomorrow?" Grace took a small sip, the amber liquid warming her throat. "I believe our arrangement was for a week to see how it went." Ethan felt a sudden concern. "Are you saying you'd like me to move on?" "No," Grace assured him quickly. "I'm saying the arrangement has worked well, better than I expected." She hesitated, then added, "I can offer slightly better terms now. The general store has agreed to extend more credit since the ranch is showing improvement." "The current terms are fine," Ethan replied. "I have everything I need." Grace nodded, relief evident in her expression. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire's dancing flames. "Spring will come early this year," Grace predicted, changing the subject. "We should prepare for calving season. There will be much more work then." "I'll be here," Ethan promised, realizing he meant it more than he'd intended. The thought of moving on had become increasingly unappealing over the past weeks. Grace glanced at him, a question in her eyes that she didn't voice. Instead, she said, "I received a letter from Mrs. Patterson in town. There's a social gathering at the church next Saturday, first one since Christmas." Ethan waited, sensing there was more. "She suggested I might attend," Grace continued, studying her glass. "Said it would be good for me to reconnect with the community. Will you go?" Ethan asked, curious about her hesitation. Grace's fingers tightened around her glass. "I haven't attended such gatherings since James died. People mean well, but their pity is difficult to bear." Ethan understood immediately. "And the unmarried men see a widow with land." "Precisely." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned that I might bring you as my ranch hand." The slight pause before ranch hand spoke volumes. Ethan realized the gossip had likely already started in town about the widow Zimmer and her live-in help. "Would my presence make it easier or harder for you?" he asked frankly. Grace considered the question. "Both, perhaps. Harder because people will talk more, easier because—" She trailed off. "Because," Ethan prompted gently. "Because I wouldn't have to face their matchmaking alone," she admitted. "And because I trust you not to have ulterior motives." The simplicity of her statement touched him more deeply than he expected. "Then I'll accompany you," he decided. As your loyal ranch hand, nothing more." Grace smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "Thank you." The social was held in the church basement, decorated with paper hearts and ribbons for the approaching Valentine's Day. Grace wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that highlighted the auburn tints in her hair, which she had pinned up more carefully than usual. Ethan, wearing the one decent shirt he owned, freshly washed and pressed, felt oddly nervous as he drove the wagon into town with Grace beside him. "It's not too late to change your mind," he offered as they approached the church. "And face Mrs. Patterson's disappointment," Grace replied with forced lightness. "I'd rather face a charging bull." The warmth of the church basement after the cold ride was welcome, but Ethan immediately noticed the curious glances and whispers that followed their entrance. Grace greeted people politely, but kept close to his side as they made their way through the crowd. Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman with an authoritative manner, descended upon them immediately. "Grace Zimmer, how wonderful to see you out and about." Her gaze shifted to Ethan, assessing him openly. "And this must be your hired man I've heard about." "Ethan Wade," Grace introduced him. "Mr. Wade, this is Mrs. Patterson, our town's most dedicated community organizer." Ethan tipped his hat respectfully. "Madam." "Mr. Wade arrived just before the big storm in January," Grace continued smoothly. "His help has been invaluable to the ranch." "I'm sure it has, Mrs. Patterson replied with a knowing smile that made Grace stiffen slightly. "Well, do enjoy yourselves. There's punch and refreshments on the table, and the band will start playing soon." As she moved away to greet other arrivals, Grace let out a small sigh. "And so it begins," she murmured. Throughout the evening, Ethan observed the complex social dynamics at play. Several of the town's unmarried men approached Grace, only to retreat when they noticed Ethan's watchful presence nearby. The women were more direct, pulling Grace aside for conversations that left her looking increasingly uncomfortable. During one such moment, when Grace had been cornered by three ladies Ethan recognized from church, Sheriff Miller approached him. "Wade, isn't it?" The sheriff asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Passing through or planning to stay?" "Working for Miss Zimmer currently," Ethan replied evenly. "Beyond that, I haven't made plans." The sheriff sipped his punch. "Town's protective of its own, you understand. Especially widows trying to manage alone." "Miss Zimmer is more than capable," Ethan said firmly, "and doesn't need the town's concern about her choice of employees." Sheriff Miller's eyebrows rose slightly. "Just doing my duty, son, making sure everyone's intentions are honorable." Before Ethan could respond, the band began playing, and couples moved to the center of the room for dancing. He spotted Grace extracting herself from her conversation, looking relieved at the interruption. Their eyes met across the room, and without thinking, Ethan moved toward her. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, surprising himself as much as her. Grace hesitated, aware of the watching eyes. "People will talk even more." "They're already talking," Ethan pointed out. "Might as well give them something worth discussing." A smile tugged at the corner of Grace's mouth. "Very well, Mr. Wade. One dance." One dance became three, and Ethan discovered that Grace moved with natural grace, following his lead as if they had danced together for years. Her hand felt small but strong in his, and he found himself increasingly aware of her proximity. The faint lavender scent of her hair, the way her eyes brightened when she smiled. When they finally took a break for refreshments, Grace's cheeks were flushed, but she looked more relaxed than Ethan had seen her since they met. "You dance well for a cowboy," she observed, accepting the cup of punch he offered. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," Ethan explained. "Said no boy of hers would stand like a fence post at social gatherings." She was a wise woman. Grace's expression softened. "Do you write to your family?" Ethan's smile faded slightly. "They're gone now. Mother passed during the war, father just after. My brothers scattered to different states. We exchange letters at Christmas, but that's about all." Grace touched his arm briefly, a gesture of understanding that required no words. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the dancers. "I believe this evening has been a success," Grace decided as they prepared to leave an hour later. "I've fulfilled my social obligation for at least 6 months." Ethan chuckled as he helped her into the wagon. "Was it truly so terrible?" "Not entirely," she admitted, arranging her skirts. "Some parts were quite enjoyable." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts under the vast, star-filled sky. When they arrived home, Ethan helped Grace down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at him in the moonlight, "for accompanying me tonight." "My pleasure," Ethan replied, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. For a brief, charged moment, he thought about closing the distance between them, but instead stepped back, releasing her. "Good night, Grace." She nodded, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "Good night, Ethan." As February gave way to March, the weather began to shift. The snow melted, revealing muddy ground beneath, and the first green shoots appeared in sheltered areas. With the changing season came new challenges: preparations for calving, planting considerations for the small vegetable garden, and plans for fence repairs that couldn't be properly completed during winter. Ethan and Grace fell into an efficient partnership, each anticipating the other's needs and thoughts with increasing accuracy. They moved around each other with the comfort of long acquaintance, despite having known each other barely 2 months. The first calf was born on a mild evening in mid-March. Grace had been watching the mother cow closely for days, recognizing the signs of impending birth. When labor began, she and Ethan kept vigil in the barn, ready to assist if necessary. "She's struggling," Grace observed worriedly as hours passed with little progress. "The calf might be positioned wrong." Ethan nodded grimly. "We may need to intervene." Together they worked to help the laboring cow, Ethan's strong arms and Grace's knowledge combining to carefully reposition the calf for delivery. When the newborn finally slid into the world, both were exhausted but triumphant. "A healthy bull calf," Grace announced, her face glowing with relief as the mother began cleaning her offspring. "Strong lungs on this one." Ethan watched her as she knelt beside the new mother and calf, her hands gentle as she checked them both over. There was a tenderness in her touch that belied her usual practical manner, a softness that emerged only in moments like these. "We did good work tonight," he said, sitting beside her on a hay bale as they monitored the new family. "We did," she agreed, unexpected tears welling in her eyes. "I wasn't sure I'd see another successful birth on this ranch." Without thinking, Ethan put his arm around her shoulders. Grace stiffened momentarily, then relaxed against him, accepting the comfort he offered. "The ranch is coming back, Grace," he assured her. "This calf is just the beginning." She nodded against his shoulder, too tired to maintain her usual distance. "I was so close to giving up before you arrived," she admitted quietly. "That day you found me burying the calf. I'd been thinking it might be time to accept one of the offers for the land." The confession cost her, he could tell. "What changed your mind?" Grace was silent for a long moment. "You did," she finally said, straightening up and meeting his eyes directly. "When you said no more burials alone, it reminded me that the hardest part wasn't the work or the losses, it was facing them by myself." Ethan held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "You're not alone anymore," he said simply. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with possibility. Then the calf let out a plaintive bleat, breaking the spell. Grace stood quickly, moving to check on the newborn, and the opportunity passed. Over the following weeks, 5 more calves were born, all healthy. The success bolstered both their spirits and their confidence in the ranch's recovery. Grace began making plans for selling some of the cattle in the summer, calculating potential profits with cautious optimism. April brought gentle rains and wildflowers to the Colorado plains. The land transformed around them, winter's starkness giving way to vibrant life. On a particularly fine morning, Grace suggested they ride the property's boundaries, both to check fences and to enjoy the day. They packed a simple lunch and set out after morning chores, riding at an easy pace through meadows dotted with blue and yellow blooms. Grace pointed out landmarks and shared stories of her childhood on the ranch, more relaxed and open than Ethan had seen her. Near the western border of the property, they stopped by a small stream for lunch. Spreading a blanket on a grassy bank, they sat in companionable silence, listening to the water's gentle music. "My father used to bring me fishing here," Grace reminisced, breaking off a piece of bread. "Said it was where he proposed to my mother. He told me that story every single time we came, as if I hadn't heard it 100 times before." Ethan smiled, picturing a younger Grace rolling her eyes at her father's repetition. "What did your mother say about it?" "She always claimed he remembered it wrong," Grace laughed. "According to her, she proposed to him, and right over there by that large boulder, not here by the stream." "And which version do you believe?" Grace considered this, her expression softening with memory. "Both, I think. They probably each remembered it the way they needed to." She glanced at him curiously. "Have you ever been married, Ethan?" "No," he replied, surprised by the direct question. "Came close once before the war. Ellen Barnes, daughter of our nearest neighbors. We'd been sweethearts since childhood." "What happened?" Grace asked, then added quickly, "If you don't mind telling me." Ethan looked out over the stream. "I went to war. She waited 2 years, then married a man who wasn't fighting. Can't blame her for that. She wanted a family, stability, things I couldn't give her then." "Do you regret it, not marrying before you left?" "Sometimes," Ethan admitted. "But the war changed me. I'm not the boy she knew anymore. Might not have worked between us even if she'd waited." Grace nodded, understanding in her eyes. "James was different after he got sick, too. Not just physically. He became distant, even before the end, as if he was already leaving me." It was the most she'd shared about her husband's death, and Ethan recognized the significance. Illness does that sometimes, makes a person turn inward. "Yes," Grace agreed quietly. "But it was still lonely, being with someone who wasn't really there anymore." She shook her head as if dispelling the memory. "I'm sorry. This isn't very cheerful lunch conversation." "No need to apologize," Ethan assured her. "It's good to talk about these things sometimes." Grace smiled gratefully, then changed the subject to their plans for the Vegetative garden. The moment of deeper connection had passed, but something had shifted between them, another layer of reserve fallen away. As they packed up to continue their ride, Ethan found himself watching Grace more closely than before, noticing the way the spring sunlight brought out copper highlights in her hair, how her profile softened when she was lost in thought. He'd been attracted to her from the beginning, but now there was something more, a deepening appreciation for the woman herself, not just her determination or resilience. The realization was both exhilarating and concerning. His position on her ranch was clear: employee, helper, perhaps friend. Anything more complicated that arrangement and risked what they'd built together. Yet when Grace turned to him, smiling as she mounted her horse, Ethan couldn't deny the warmth that spread through his chest. Whatever was growing between them, he wasn't sure he could or wanted to stop it. Their ride back to the ranch was leisurely, both reluctant to end the pleasant day. As they approached the final ridge before home, Grace suddenly pulled her horse to a stop. "Riders," she said tersely, pointing toward the ranch house below. Ethan followed her gaze and saw 3 men on horseback in the yard, expecting visitors. "No." Grace's expression had closed, her earlier relaxation vanishing. "That's Thomas Blackwell's horse. He owns the largest ranch in the county. And the other 2. His foreman and probably one of his hands." Grace's jaw tightened. "He's been trying to buy my land since James died, becomes more insistent each time." Ethan felt a protective anger rising. "Has he threatened you?" "Not outright, but he makes it clear the offer won't remain open indefinitely." Grace straightened in her saddle. "We should go down. No sense delaying the inevitable." They rode down to the yard where the 3 men waited. Thomas Blackwell was a large man in his 50s, expensively dressed with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He watched their approach with calculating eyes. "Miss Zimmer," he greeted, tipping his hat without dismounting. "Been trying to catch you at home. Your neighbor Abbott mentioned you were out riding today." "Mr. Blackwell," Grace acknowledged coolly. "What brings you to my property?" Blackwell's gaze shifted to Ethan, assessing. "Private business matters. Perhaps we could speak inside." "Mr. Wade works for me," Grace replied firmly. "Anything you have to say can be said in front of him." A flash of irritation crossed Blackwell's face before he controlled it. "As you wish." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "I've come with a new offer for your land, considerably more generous than my previous ones." Grace made no move to take the envelope. "My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Blackwell. The ranch is not for sale." "You might want to consider this offer before refusing," Blackwell advised, his tone hardening. "Word in town is you lost several calves this winter. Banks won't extend credit forever, even to a widow." Ethan bristled at the implied threat, but Grace's hand on his arm stopped him from speaking. "The ranch is recovering," she stated evenly. "We've had 6 healthy calves this spring with more expected. By summer we'll be turning a profit again." Blackwell's eyebrows rose at her use of "we," his gaze returning to Ethan with new interest. "I see. And you are?" "Ethan Wade," he supplied, meeting the man's gaze directly. "Miss Zimmer's ranch manager." The title was an overstatement of his role, but Ethan understood the importance of presenting a united front to this man who clearly saw Grace as vulnerable. "Ranch manager," Blackwell repeated skeptically. "Well, Mr. Wade, perhaps you can convince Miss Zimmer to see reason. Her 50 acres would complete my southern grazing lands quite nicely, and my offer would allow her to live comfortably in town." "I believe Miss Zimmer is capable of making her own decisions," Ethan replied. "And she's been quite clear about this one." Blackwell's expression darkened. "This land's too much for a woman alone, even with help." His gaze swept meaningfully between them. Grace stiffened beside him, and Ethan felt a surge of anger at the implication. "Mr. Blackwell," Grace said coldly, "I've tolerated your persistence out of respect for your standing in the community, but I won't tolerate insults on my own property. Please leave." For a tense moment, Blackwell remained where he was, clearly unaccustomed to being dismissed. Then he placed the envelope on a fence post. "The offer stands until the end of the month," he said, turning his horse. "I suggest you consider it carefully, Miss Zimmer. These lands can be dangerous for those without proper resources." The veiled threat hung in the air as the 3 men rode away. Once they were out of earshot, Grace let out a shaky breath. "I hate that man," she admitted quietly. "Has he always been this persistent?" Ethan asked, still watching the retreating figures. "He's been interested in the land for years, even when my father was alive." Grace dismounted, her movements tense. but he's become more aggressive since James died. This is the fourth offer he's made, each one higher than the last. Yes, Grace looked troubled. Which means he wants this land badly enough to pay more than it's worth. I just don't understand why these particular acres matter so much to him when he already owns thousands. Ethan dismounted as well, taking the reins of both horses. Maybe we should find out. Over the next few days, Ethan made discreet inquiries in town while purchasing supplies. The bartender at the saloon was particularly informative after Ethan bought him a whiskey. Blackwell's been buying up every parcel he can in that area, the man confided. Paying top dollar too. Word is, the railroad's planning a new line through the county, and Blackwell knows something about the proposed route. Ethan considered this information as he rode back to the ranch. If the railroad was indeed coming through or near Grace's property, the land would be worth far more than Blackwell was offering. It would explain the man's persistence and increasing offers. When he shared his findings with Grace that evening, her expression hardened with anger. "That snake," she said, pacing the kitchen. "He knows I've been struggling and hoped I'd sell before I discovered the truth. If the railroad does come through, you could sell for triple what he's offering," Ethan pointed out. "Or keep the land and benefit from having the railroad nearby for your cattle business." Grace stopped pacing, a determined light entering her eyes. "I need to confirm this information. If it's true, I can use it to secure a larger loan from the bank to tide us over until the cattle sale." "Us," Ethan echoed, catching the pronoun she'd used twice now. Grace met his gaze steadily. "Yes, us. Unless you're planning to move on soon." The question hung between them, more significant than it appeared on the surface. Ethan realized his answer would define what came next for both of them. "No," he said finally. "I'm not planning to go anywhere." The relief in Grace's smile made his heart skip. "Good," she said simply. The following morning, Grace rode into town to speak with the bank manager and make her own inquiries about the railroad rumors. Ethan stayed behind to tend the ranch, keeping a watchful eye on the road in case Blackwell decided to return in Grace's absence. She returned mid-afternoon, her expression triumphant as she dismounted. "It's confirmed," she announced without preamble. "The Railroad Commission has approved a route that passes through the southeast corner of our property. Mr. Morris at the bank was quite accommodating once I mentioned this fact. He extended your credit better. He approved a proper loan with favorable terms." Grace's eyes sparkled with satisfaction. "We can hire additional help for the summer and purchase more breeding stock in the fall." Ethan grinned, infected by her enthusiasm. Blackwell must be furious that his scheme didn't work. "Oh, I imagine he will be," Grace agreed, her smile turning mischievous. "Especially when he learns I've granted the railroad their right-of-way in exchange for a very generous compensation package." Ethan laughed out loud, impressed by her quick action. "You've been busy today." "Very." Grace unpacked her saddlebags, pulling out a bottle of champagne. "I thought we might celebrate. It's not every day one outsmarts the county's wealthiest rancher." That evening they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant colors while sharing the champagne in mismatched teacups, the only suitable vessels Grace could find. "To the future of Zimmer Ranch," Ethan toasted, raising his cup. "And to partnerships," Grace added, meeting his eyes over the rim of her cup. The word held possibilities that made Ethan's pulse quicken. As the golden light faded into dusk, their conversation flowed easily, ranging from practical ranch plans to childhood memories to books they'd both read. With each exchange, Ethan felt the remaining distance between them diminishing. When the stars emerged in full brilliance above them, Grace fell silent, her expression contemplative as she gazed upward. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked softly. "That I haven't felt this hopeful in years," she admitted, turning to look at him. "Not since before James got sick." "The ranch's prospects are certainly looking up," Ethan agreed. "It's not just the ranch." Grace set down her empty cup, her fingers fidgeting slightly in a rare display of nervousness. "When you arrived that day, finding me at my lowest point, I thought you were just a temporary solution to an immediate problem." "And now," Ethan prompted when she paused. Grace took a deep breath. "Now I realize you're more than that, much more." The admission hung between them, fragile and momentous. Ethan set his own cup aside and moved closer to her on the porch swing. "Grace," he said carefully, "I need to be clear about something. I didn't stay because I pitied you or saw an opportunity. I stayed because working alongside you, seeing your strength and determination, it made me want to be part of what you're building here." "And is that still all you want?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To be my ranch manager," Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "No," he admitted. "That's not all I want." Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Then what do you want?" Ethan weighed. Instead of answering with words, Ethan closed the distance between them, pressing his lips to hers in a gentle kiss. Grace responded immediately, her hand coming up to rest against his chest as she leaned into him. The kiss deepened, months of unspoken feelings finding expression in this connection. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I want this," he said simply. "You, us, a future here together." Grace smiled, her eyes shining in the starlight. "I want that too," she whispered. "I think I have for some time now." They stayed on the porch late into the night, talking and planning and sharing more kisses, rediscovering parts of themselves that grief and loneliness had buried. When Grace finally rose to go inside, she extended her hand to Ethan. "Stay with me tonight," she invited softly. "Not in the stable, here with me." Ethan took her hand, his heart full. "Are you certain?" "More certain than I've been about anything in years," Grace assured him, leading him inside. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. The physical expression of their love felt like coming home after years of wandering, natural and right in ways neither had expected to find again. In the quiet darkness afterward, Grace nestled against Ethan's chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she confessed. "After James died, I convinced myself that part of my life was over." Ethan stroked her hair gently. "I understand. I'd given up on finding a place to belong." "And now," Grace prompted, echoing his earlier question. "Now I know this is where I'm meant to be." Ethan pressed a kiss to her forehead. "With you, on this land." The following days brought practical considerations. They agreed to keep their relationship discreet until after the spring cattle sale, not wanting to fuel town gossip that might affect business dealings. Ethan continued to sleep in the stable when ranch hands or neighbors might be around, though he spent most nights in Grace's bed. They worked side by side during the days, their partnership strengthened by their deepening personal bond. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, the cattle herd growing stronger and healthier as spring progressed toward summer. Thomas Blackwell made one more attempt to purchase the ranch, his offer nearly double his previous one. Grace declined politely but firmly, taking satisfaction in his poorly concealed frustration. "He knows he's beaten," she remarked to Ethan after Blackwell departed. "The railroad negotiations are public knowledge now." "He underestimated you," Ethan replied, pulling her into his arms now that they were alone again. "A mistake many men seem to make." "Did you?" Grace teased, wrapping her arms around his neck. Underestimate you? Never. Ethan kissed her lightly. Intimidated by you? Frequently. Grace laughed, the sound free and joyful in a way it hadn't been when they first met. Good. A healthy respect will serve you well in this relationship. By late May, the time came for the spring cattle drive to the railhead in Denver. Grace hired 3 experienced hands to assist, and for 2 weeks, Ethan led the operation while she managed the ranch. The separation was difficult for both of them, but the successful sale brought a substantial profit that justified the temporary hardship. Upon Ethan's return, they made a decision. Riding into town together, they visited first the bank to deposit the cattle proceeds, then the church to speak with the minister. "We'd like to be married," Grace informed Reverend Taylor directly. "As soon as possible." The Reverend, who had known Grace since childhood, appeared momentarily surprised but recovered quickly. "I see. And have you considered the implications, Grace? It's been less than 3 years since James passed." "I've considered everything," Grace replied with quiet dignity. "James would want me to be happy. Ethan makes me happy." The Reverend turned his attention to Ethan. "And your intentions, Mr. Wade? The Zimmer ranch is a valuable property." Ethan met the man's gaze steadily. "My intention is to be a good husband to Grace and to help her build the ranch into everything she envisions. I have no interest in her property beyond making it a success for our future together." After a thoughtful pause, Reverend Taylor nodded. "Very well. I can perform the ceremony next Sunday after services, if that suits you both." News of their engagement spread quickly through Colorado City. Reactions were mixed. Some expressed genuine happiness for Grace finding love again, while others whispered about the hasty nature of the relationship and Ethan's convenient position as her employee. Mrs. Patterson took it upon herself to organize a small reception after the ceremony, declaring that every bride deserves a proper celebration, even a second-time one. The wedding day arrived clear and warm, a perfect early June Sunday. Grace wore a simple cream-colored dress, newly made for the occasion, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Ethan, in a new suit purchased with his cattle drive earnings, waited for her at the altar with an expression of wonder that silenced even the most skeptical whispers among the congregation. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Taylor began once the regular Sunday service had concluded and those not interested in the wedding had departed. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Grace Zimmer and Ethan Wade in holy matrimony." The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When they exchanged vows, Ethan added his own personal promise. "Grace, I found you burying a calf in the snow, and I told you there would be no more burials alone. Today I expand that promise. There will be no more joys alone, no more sorrows alone, no more challenges or victories alone. Whatever life brings us, we will face it together until my last breath." Grace's eyes shimmered with tears as she responded. "Ethan, you came into my life when I had nearly lost hope. You didn't just help me save my ranch, you helped me remember how to live, how to love, how to look forward instead of backward. I promise to walk beside you through whatever comes, as your partner, your friend, and your wife." When Reverend Taylor pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed Grace with a tenderness that brought smiles to even the most doubtful faces in the church. The reception at the town hall was more festive than either had expected. It seemed the community had decided to embrace their union, perhaps recognizing the genuine love between them. Mrs. Patterson had outdone herself with decorations and refreshments, and someone had even arranged for a small band to play for dancing. "Mrs. Wade," Ethan murmured as they took their first dance as husband and wife. "How does it sound? "Wonderful," Grace replied, her face glowing with happiness. "Though I hope you don't mind if the ranch remains Zimmer Ranch, for tradition's sake." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Ethan assured her. "Your family built that legacy. I'm honored to help carry it forward." As summer progressed into fall, Ethan and Grace settled into married life with surprising ease. The ranch prospered under their joint management, and they reinvested most of the profits into improvements and expanding the herd. The railroad construction began on schedule, bringing temporary work opportunities to the area and increasing the value of their land considerably. By the time the first snow fell in November, the Zimmer Ranch was more financially secure than it had been in years. On a cold December evening, as they sat by the fire in their home, Grace placed Ethan's hand on her still flat stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes bright with emotion. "We're going to have a baby." Ethan's expression transformed from confusion to wonder to pure joy in the span of seconds. "A baby? Are you certain?" Grace nodded, happy tears spilling onto her cheeks. "Dr. Thompson confirmed it yesterday when I went into town. We should expect our child in early summer." Ethan gathered her into his arms, overwhelmed by the news. "Grace, I don't have words." "I know," she whispered, holding him tightly. "I never thought I'd have this chance. With James, we tried for years." "Thank you," Ethan said fervently, kissing her tear-streaked face. "For this gift, for everything." As the winter deepened outside, they made plans for their growing family. They would convert the unused bedroom into a nursery, expand the garden in spring to grow more vegetables, perhaps hire a permanent hand to help with the heavier ranch work as Grace's pregnancy progressed. Christmas came with a heavy snowfall that blanketed the ranch in pristine white. On Christmas Eve, Ethan surprised Grace with a handcrafted cradle he'd been secretly working on for weeks. "It's beautiful," she exclaimed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Where did you learn such craftsmanship?" "My grandfather was a furniture maker," Ethan explained. "He taught me the basics when I was young. I've been practicing whenever you were napping." Grace laughed, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Our child will sleep well in this." "Children," Ethan corrected with a smile. "I made it sturdy enough to last for all our future little ones." Grace raised an eyebrow. "How many are you planning on, Mr. Wade?" "As many as you're willing to give me," he replied, pulling her close. "This ranch could use a house full of children running around." On New Year's Day, they rode out to the spot where they had first met. The small grave of the calf was now barely visible under the snow, but Grace had marked it with stones that stood out against the white landscape. "This is where our story began," she reflected, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, "with a burial and a promise." Ethan took her gloved hand in his. "And look how far we've come since then." Grace smiled up at him, her free hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. "I never imagined that day would lead to this, a new marriage, a child on the way, the ranch thriving." "No more burials alone," Ethan repeated his first words to her. "No more anything alone." As they stood together on that hillside, looking out over the land that had brought them together, the future stretched before them full of promise. The cycle of life continued, loss and renewal, endings and beginnings, winter giving way to spring. And through it all, they would face whatever came, side by side. The years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising to the Zimmer-Wade family. Their first child, a son they named Daniel James Wade, arrived in June 1878, healthy and strong with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined eyes. 2 years later, they welcomed twin daughters, Hannah and Margaret, whose arrival during a spring thunderstorm became one of Colorado City's favorite tales. The Zimmer Ranch grew into one of the most prosperous in the county, known for its quality cattle and fair business practices. Ethan and Grace worked as equal partners, each contributing their strengths to build something greater than either could have accomplished alone. When Thomas Blackwell faced financial ruin after a series of poor investments in 1882, it was Grace who approached him with a fair offer for his struggling ranch. The irony was not lost on either of them when he accepted, grateful to salvage some dignity from the situation. Ethan never forgot the sight that had changed his life. Grace standing alone in the snow, burying a calf with determination, despite her breaking heart. Sometimes, on winter evenings when their children were asleep and the house was quiet, he would remind her of that day and how close they had both come to missing the life they now shared. "It was fate," Grace would say, nestled in his arms by the fire. "You were meant to ride by that day." "It was more than fate," Ethan would reply, kissing her softly. "It was the beginning of everything that matters." And on the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, they rode together to the spot where it had all begun. The old grave was long since absorbed back into the earth, but they both remembered. Standing there under a clear winter sky, surrounded by the land they had nurtured together, they renewed the promise that had started their journey. No more burials alone. No more joys alone. No more life alone. Just two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, building a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone.